I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it.
Prince William has always been patient, calm, and controlled, but something recently pushed him past his limit. And now Camilla's children are discovering that being close to the crown was never the same as being safe inside it. What really happened behind those palace walls, and how far is William prepared to go? Join us as we reveal the royal shakeup that is quietly changing everything. The silent shockwave. Not every earthquake announces itself with noise, and the most significant shifts inside the British royal family rarely arrive with headlines or formal statements. They arrive instead as whispers, as small details that gather quietly until the picture they form becomes impossible to ignore. Those whispers began circulating among royal insiders with a consistency that could not be dismissed as speculation, and what they described was not a personality clash or a family disagreement of the kind that surfaces and fades, but something with far more structural weight, a shift in where power was sitting and who was being quietly moved away from it. Queen Camilla's family, those who had assumed that proximity to the throne carried with it a certain durability of access and influence, began to sense that the ground beneath them was not as solid as it had always appeared. And that realization, arriving without announcement or explanation, carried its own particular kind of shock. The tension was not about personalities in the way that royal drama is often framed for public consumption. It was about something colder and more institutional, about the invisible architecture of access and authority that determines who sits close to power and who gradually finds themselves on the outside looking in. What made the shockwave silent was precisely the absence of any visible confrontation, because the most consequential power shifts inside institutions like the British monarchy do not happen through argument or declaration. They happen through the slow and deliberate repositioning of people and resources and attention, until the new reality is simply the one that exists. The whispers were growing, the insiders were watching, and something that had been assumed to be permanent was beginning, very quietly, to move. The man changing. The rules. For most of his adult life, Prince William had worn patience like a second skin, moving through the public eye with a careful and measured quality that suggested someone who understood his role deeply and was willing to inhabit it on the timeline that history had always prescribed, waiting, watching, supporting, and trusting that his moment would arrive in its own time without needing to be forced or accelerated. That image, so consistent and so familiar, began to shift somewhere around the middle of the decade, not dramatically or suddenly, but in the way that real changes tend to happen inside institutions built on traditions and discretion, gradually and then all at once, until the person looking back at the public was recognizably the same man but operating with an entirely different energy underneath the surface. Those who observed William closely began to notice a new quality in the way he engaged with royal operations, a directness that had not always been so visible, a willingness to make decisions and hold positions that went beyond the diplomatic neutrality that had characterized his earlier public years, and the reading among those who understood palace dynamics was consistent. William was no longer simply preparing for kingship, he was already practicing it. The shift was not born from impatience or ambition in the conventional sense, but from something more considered and more purposeful, from the understanding that the monarchy he would one day lead was navigating genuine questions about its relevance and its future, and that those questions required someone willing to make clear choices about what that future would look like and who would be part of shaping it. He had watched his father inherit a crown already surrounded by complexity, had watched the institution absorb the consequences of decisions made by others, and had drawn from all of that a set of conclusions about the kind of monarchy he intended to build, one that was leaner and more focused and far more deliberately controlled than the version he was inheriting. The man who had once been described primarily in terms of his steadiness and his restraint was now being described in different terms entirely, as someone who knew exactly what he wanted the next chapter to look like, and who was quietly but unmistakably beginning to write it, with or without. The agreement of those who had assumed their place in that chapter was already secured. The turning point. There are years that function as hinges in the life of an institution, years where the accumulated pressure of slow change finally tips into something visible and measurable, And for the British monarchy, 2025 began to reveal itself as precisely that kind of year. The point at which what had been building quietly beneath the surface finally became observable to anyone paying close enough attention. The changes in William's behavior were no longer subtle enough to require insider knowledge to detect. They had moved from the private world of palace dynamics into something more plainly visible in the pattern of his public engagements, his statements, and the way the institution around him was beginning to organize itself in relation to his authority, rather than simply his future authority. He was taking on more, not in the performative sense of a royal who appears at events and delivers prepared remarks, but in the structural sense of someone who was inserting himself into decisions about how the monarchy operated, how it communicated, and how it positioned itself in relation to the public and the press. And the people around him were responding to that insertion not with resistance, but with a deference that told its own story. The palace itself appeared to be actively participating in the elevation, adjusting its machinery in ways that directed more authority toward William, and positioned him not as the heir waiting in the wings, but as the central figure around whom the institution's future was already being organized. And that distinction between waiting and already arriving was significant enough to change the entire atmosphere of how royal watchers and insiders discussed what was coming. For those whose relationship with the monarchy had been built on their connection to Charles and Camilla rather than to William directly, the shift carried an unmistakable implication. Because an institution reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity does not simply add a new figure to an existing structure. It rearranges the entire structure around that figure, and that rearrangement inevitably changes who is close and who is not. 2025 was not the beginning of William's ascent. That had been underway for years, but it was the year the ascent became impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was. A transition already in motion, already reshaping everything it touched and moving in only one direction. The estate that spoke loudly. There is a language that operates beneath the formal announcements and public statements of royal life. A language written not in words but in property and titles and the quiet transfer of assets that carry centuries of meaning within them. And when that language speaks, those who understand it listen very carefully. Because what it says is almost always more significant than anything communicated through official channels. The transfer of the Cedar Estate to Prince William spoke in that language with a clarity that required very little interpretation, because estates within the royal world are not simply parcels of land or collections of buildings. They are expressions of power and positioning. They carry with them access and influence and a kind of institutional weight that cannot be separated from the question of who holds them and why. Cedar Estate represented something concrete in a story that had, until that point, been told largely through atmospherics and inference, through whispers and adjustments, and the slow repositioning of people and priorities that had been building for months. And its transfer to William converted all of that atmosphere into something tangible and recorded and impossible to walk back. Property within the royal family has always functioned as a map of power, showing with more honesty than almost any other indicator where the institution believes its future lies and who it is investing in as the custodian of that future. And a map that places a significant estate in William's hands at this particular moment in the monarchy's history is a map that is making a very specific argument about where authority is heading. For those watching from the outside, the transfer confirmed what the pattern of the preceding months had already suggested, that the transition underway was not simply ceremonial or symbolic, but structural, involving the actual redistribution of the resources and assets that give royal power its material reality. And that redistribution was proceeding with a purposefulness that left very little room for ambiguity about its direction or its intention. William was not simply being prepared for a future role, he was being equipped for it in real time, handed the tools of a king while still formally the heir. And the estate was the clearest evidence yet that the institution had already decided, in the ways that matter most, that the future had effectively begun. The line in the sand. There is a particular kind of disappointment that arrives not through confrontation or argument, but through the slow and dawning realization that something you believed was permanent was always, in fact, conditional. And for Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes, the children Camilla brought with her into the orbit of the British royal family, that realization appears to have arrived with a quiet force that no amount of public composure could entirely conceal. Their position had always been unusual, neither fully inside the royal system nor entirely outside it, occupying a space that was defined almost entirely by their mother's relationship with Charles, and for as long as that relationship remained the central fact of their proximity to power, the arrangement had a logic and a stability that made it feel, if not permanent, then at least durable enough to build around. What the shifting landscape around William began to expose was the fragility underneath that stability, because the access and inclusion that Camilla's children had enjoyed was never written into the architecture of the institution itself. It was written into the personal goodwill of a king who loved their mother, and personal goodwill, however genuine, does not automatically transfer to the next generation of royal authority. William had grown up with a complicated relationship to the story of his parents' marriage, had watched the consequences of that story play out in ways that left marks no amount of time had fully erased. And while he had conducted himself with remarkable public restraint on the subject for most of his adult life, the question of how he viewed the place of Camilla's family within the institution he was preparing to lead was one that the transfer of power was beginning to answer in practical rather than personal terms. The line being drawn was not presented as a rejection. There was no announcement, no formal exclusion, no dramatic moment of confrontation that could be pointed to as the turning point. Instead, it was communicated in the same quiet institutional language that had characterized the entire power shift, through absence and adjustment, and the gradual withdrawal of the proximity that Tom and Laura had come to regard as part of the landscape of their lives. What made the situation particularly layered was the genuine affection that existed in parts of it, because Camilla's relationship with her children is by all accounts warm and devoted, and Charles had welcomed them into his world with a generosity that appeared sincere rather than performed. And yet warmth and generosity at the personal level had never been able to guarantee the institutional position that Tom and Laura might have hoped would follow naturally from their mother's elevation to queen. The line in the sand was drawn not in anger, but in architecture, in the quiet reorganization of who would have access and influence in the monarchy that William was building. And for two people who had spent years existing in the comfortable middle ground between private family and public institution, finding themselves on the wrong side of that line carried a weight that was difficult to overstate. A closing of a door that had always felt, until recently, as though it would remain open. Eat the comment that crossed the line. There are moments when the gap between how someone perceives their own position and how that position is actually viewed by those with power becomes suddenly and uncomfortably visible. And for Tom Parker Bowles, that moment arrived through something that might have seemed from the outside entirely harmless. A joke made in the relaxed and informal atmosphere of a podcast, delivered with the easy confidence of someone who believed he understood the boundaries of what was and was not acceptable. The joke in question centered on the idea of Tom styling himself as Prince Tom, a playful riff on his proximity to royalty that was intended, in all likelihood, as the kind of self-deprecating humor that disarms rather than provokes, the sort of comment that signals an awareness of one's unusual position, while simultaneously making light of it in a way that invites the audience to laugh, along without reading anything too seriously into the premise. But humor inside the orbit of the royal family operates according to rules that are not always visible to those who have not spent their entire lives navigating them. And what reads as harmless self-deprecation in one context can read as something considerably more problematic in another, particularly when the institution in question is acutely sensitive to anything that blurs the line between those who belong to it formally and those who exist in its proximity through personal rather than constitutional connection. From William's perspective, or at least from the perspective of those who understood how he was approaching the question of who would have a voice in the monarchy he was building, a public joke about a title was not simply a joke. It was evidence of something more concerning, the suggestion of an attitude toward royal identity that treated the boundaries of the institution as flexible and negotiable rather than fixed and serious. And that attitude, however lightly expressed, represented exactly the kind of uncontrolled public behavior that William appeared determined to eliminate from the world around him. The concept of discipline around public communication had become increasingly central to the way William was shaping his future court. informed in no small part by his observation of what happened when people adjacent to the royal family felt entitled to speak freely and publicly about their connection to it, and the consequences that followed both for those individuals and for the institution itself, consequences that had played out visibly and painfully enough to leave very little room for ambiguity about the risks involved. Tom's podcast comment was not, in isolation, a catastrophic act of misjudgment, but it arrived at a moment when the tolerance for that kind of casual public performance of royal adjacency was already at its lowest, and it confirmed in a very concrete and specific way a concern that had likely already been forming about whether Camilla's children understood the new reality well enough to operate safely within it. Access without discipline, William appeared to have concluded, was not access at all, it was a liability, and liabilities in the monarchy he intended to lead would be managed with a decisiveness that left no room for ambiguity about where the boundaries now sat and who was expected to respect them. The emotional history resurfaces. There are conflicts that appear to resolve themselves and then reveal, years later, that what actually happened was not resolution, but suspension. A mutual agreement to set something down without examining it too closely. And the history between Prince William and Laura Lopes belongs to that category. A history shaped by forces that neither of them chose, and wounds that were never entirely healed by the passage of time or the performance of reconciliation. The roots of the tension reach back into the years when William was still a child, and the story of his parents' marriage was unraveling in public in ways that caused damage whose full extent would only become clear much later. And Camilla Parker Bowles, Laura's mother, was at the center of that story in a way that made her, in the eyes of a grieving and protective son, something more than simply a complicating factor in his parents' relationship. William's feelings about Camilla during those years were never a secret, even when they were never formally stated, because grief and loyalty have a way of expressing themselves through behavior that requires no verbal declaration, and the distance he maintained from her and from the world she represented was a distance that had its own clear meaning, a statement about who he held responsible for what his family had become and what his mother had endured. Laura existed in that landscape as Camilla's daughter, which placed her in a position that was never entirely fair, but was also never entirely separable from the larger story surrounding her mother. And the interactions between her and William during those years carried the weight of everything that neither of them was saying. A politeness stretched thin over a foundation of unresolved feeling that had nowhere safe to go. The wedding of William and Catherine in 2011 had appeared to offer a moment of genuine softening, a public occasion where the presence of Camilla's family suggested that old wounds had healed sufficiently to allow for something resembling normal family function. And those who wanted to believe in the reconciliation found enough evidence in the photographs and the shared celebrations to construct a narrative of forgiveness and forward movement. But reconciliation performed at a wedding, and reconciliation that has genuinely reshaped the emotional landscape between people, are not always the same thing, and the years that followed suggested that what had happened in 2011 was closer to the former than the latter, a suspension of hostility rather than a transformation of it, held in place by the shared understanding that open conflict served no one's interests, and that the institution required a degree of functional harmony even where genuine warmth was absent. What the power shift around William began to do was remove the incentive for that suspension, because as he moved closer to the full authority of kingship, the calculus around managing old tensions for the sake of institutional appearances began to shift, and feelings that had been carefully contained within the boundaries of necessary diplomacy began, very quietly but very perceptibly, to inform the practical decisions being made about who would be close to the new center of royal power and who would not. History, it turned out, had not disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the moment when it no longer needed to be quiet. The Christmas signal. There are few settings in the calendar of British royal life that carry more symbolic weight than Sandringham at Christmas, because the gathering that takes place there each year is not simply a family holiday. It is a carefully curated statement about who belongs within the innermost circle of the monarchy, and the guest list, read correctly, functions as a map of inclusion and exclusion that those who understand royal dynamics interpret with considerable attention. The absence of Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes from that gathering, arriving at a moment when the power shift around William was already well underway, was not the kind of detail that passed without notice among those who had been following the story closely, because Sandringham at Christmas is precisely the kind of occasion where presence confirms belonging and absence confirms something else entirely, something that no official explanation can entirely neutralize. A public explanation was offered, as it always is when the mechanics of royal inclusion produce outcomes that require some degree of management, framed in the language of personal scheduling and private family arrangements rather than in the institutional language that would more accurately describe what the absence represented. And the explanation was accepted in the way that such explanations tend to be accepted, politely and without open challenge, while the more significant reading of events continued quietly underneath. What made the absence particularly resonant was the timing, arriving as it did against the backdrop of everything that had been building throughout the year. The power transfers, the boundary drawing, the podcast comment and its reception, the resurfacing of old emotional history, all of it accumulating into a context that made the Sandringham guest list feel less like a logistical outcome and more like a considered decision communicated through the precise mechanism the royal family has always preferred for its most sensitive messages. The palace's irritation at the level of media coverage the absence generated was itself revealing, because institutions that are genuinely unbothered by a narrative do not typically display irritation at its circulation, and the visible discomfort with the attention being paid to who was and was not at Sandringham suggested an awareness that the absence was being read correctly and a preference that it had not been read quite so publicly or quite so clearly. For Tom and Laura, the message carried by that empty chair at the Christmas table was one that no amount of diplomatic framing could entirely soften, because they understood, as everyone involved understood, that Sandringham is not a place where absences happen by accident. It is a place where every presence and every absence is the result of a choice, and the choice that had been made spoke with a clarity that required no translation. The real battlefield. There is a tendency when observing the dynamics of the British royal family from the outside to frame what is happening primarily in personal terms, as a story about relationships and feelings and the complicated human texture of a family navigating change under extraordinary pressure. And while that framing is not wrong, it is incomplete, because underneath the personal story runs a structural one that is in many ways more consequential and more permanent in its implications. The real battlefield on which the future of the monarchy is being contested is not the one defined by who attended which Christmas gathering or whose podcast comment caused quiet palace fury. It is the one defined by property and titles and the legal and institutional frameworks through which royal power is actually held and transmitted. And on that battlefield, the moves being made are not reversible in the way that personal tensions can sometimes soften and shift over time. Estates within the royal world represent something that ordinary real estate cannot fully communicate, because they are not simply assets in the financial sense. They are expressions of position and permanence, carrying with them access to the networks and resources and symbolic authority that give royal power its material foundation. And the redistribution of those estates in the direction of William represents a restructuring of that foundation that will outlast any individual relationship or personal dynamic. The question of what happens when Charles is gone sits at the center of everything, because it is the question that transforms all of the current maneuverings from preliminary positioning into final reality. And the answer being constructed through the practical decisions of the present moment is an answer about a monarchy that will be smaller and more controlled and organized around a much tighter definition of who constitutes the working core of the institution. Titles will follow the same logic as property, moving toward those within William's definition of the monarchy's necessary membership, and away from those whose connection to the institution was always personal rather than constitutional. And for Camilla's children, who never held titles within the royal family to begin with, the loss will be less about formal designation and more about the informal access and proximity that titles enable and that their absence forecloses. What is being built on this battlefield is not simply a new configuration of the existing monarchy, but a deliberate reimagining of what the monarchy is for and who it belongs to. And that reimagining has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate circle of people affected by it, touching the broader question of what the institution will look like and how it will function in the decades ahead, when William's vision for it has had the time and the authority to fully take shape: the inevitable future. There is a particular quality to the kind of change that has been building inside the British monarchy throughout this period, a quality of inevitability that distinguishes it from ordinary turbulence, because what is unfolding is not a crisis that might resolve itself, or a conflict that might find its way to compromise. It is a transition with its destination already written into the structure of succession itself, and that destination is approaching with the steady certainty of something that was always going to arrive. Camilla's journey from the most controversial figure in the royal family's modern history to Queen Consort had been one of the more remarkable rehabilitations the monarchy had ever witnessed, built over decades of patient public service and supported by a king who used the authority of his position to smooth a path that public opinion had once made to feel impassable. And yet, the title she holds carries within it a limitation that the title of king does not, because it is a position defined entirely by its relationship to another, and when that relationship ends, the authority attached to it ends with it. When Charles is gone, Camilla becomes Queen Dowager, a title carrying dignity but not institutional weight, and the influence she has accumulated will not transfer to her children or to the networks built around her. It will simply recede, leaving her in honored retirement and leaving Tom and Laura in a position considerably further from power than the one they currently occupy. Ray Mill House, the property Camilla has quietly secured for her children, reads in this context as an act of strategic foresight by a woman who understands the institution well enough to know exactly what is coming, because securing a home for Tom and Laura is a way of ensuring that when the transition arrives, it does not leave them entirely without foundation, even as it removes them from the proximity to power they have known throughout their adult lives. William's monarchy will be defined by choices he has already begun making, leaner in its structure, stricter in its boundaries, and organized around a vision of the institution that has very little room for the kind of peripheral royal adjacency that Camilla's children have occupied for 2 decades. Proximity to the crown has never guaranteed a place within it, and the future being built around William will make that distinction permanent, quietly but completely, and without any need for a formal announcement to confirm what the architecture of power has already decided.